We are now going to move on to a much more complex group of organisms known as the phylum Chordata. These organisms are a overview of organisms that contain a group of organisms that have backbones. And many of these backbones are made up of vertebrae. Vertebrae are segments of bone and sometimes other hard substances that are arranged into a backbone. All of the phylum Chordata contains what is known as a notochord. A notochord is a rod of tough, flexible material that runs the length of the organism's body and provides a significant part of the organism's support. Now, the picture you see here is the vast array of organisms that are included in this phylum Chordata. And you see that it goes all the way from this very early form to mammals, in which man is included. And we will talk about all the way until the amphibian in this lecture, and then in the next lecture we will take in the remainder of these animals. It may take 2 lectures to take in the remainder of these animals. Now, the chordata can be divided into several types. One is called the Urochordata. Urochordata are those organisms in this phylum whose notochord is only present during the larval stage, and then it disappears in an adult. And this is an example, and if you remember the previous picture, you'll remember that this was a very early organism in the group known as Chordata. The second group is called a Cephalochordata. Cephalochordata has a notochord present throughout the life of the organism, so both in the early phase as well as in the adult phase. And this is a lancelet, which is probably the simplest of the cephalochordatas that are present. Now, the last of the 3 groups is called the Vitabrata, or Vertebrata. This is where the notochord is present early in development and then changes into bones. And this includes organisms later and more advanced in the group. It includes mammals and also man. So you have the Urochordata, which is the simplest group, which has a notochord only present during the larval stage. You have the Cephalochordata that has a notochord present throughout life, but never develops a true backbone. And then the Vertebrata, which is the notochord is present early, but then this changes into a real backbone. Now, this is a picture of a lancelet. A lancelet has some specific aspects that we have to take note of. First of all, it has a dorsal nerve cord. Now, this is exactly the opposite as the arthropods we were looking at before. The arthropods have a ventral nerve cord. Now, what's the difference between a ventral and a dorsal? Well, the dorsal nerve cord is up here toward the back. The ventral surface is the belly surface. The dorsal surface is the back surface. And the notochord in the chordata is found in the dorsal surface. The ventral surface, as I said, is the belly side of the organism. And so in arthropods, the notochord, or the dorsal or the ventral nerve cord, is found in this area. And you see that the dorsal nerve cord is seen in association with the notochord. And when this becomes a higher level with backbone, this actually protects this dorsal nerve cord. This is an example of Urochordata. Urochordata began as a larva. The larva, as you can see, has many of the characteristics that look like what we see in the lancelet. And the nerve cord, the dorsal nerve cord, is here, and the notochord is here. but then it attaches itself to the ground or the bottom of the water body, and then over a period of time, as it matures, it develops, or it loses its notochord. And here's the larval stage with the notochord here and the dorsal nerve cord here with the brain here. And here's the adult, and the adult takes in fluid here. It passes through a gill area where oxygen is extracted, and then it passes out this way. And so this is the most simple of the chordates. Now here's the lancelet. And lancelet is a prime example of a cephalochordata. Cephalochordatas have notochords throughout their life. The notochord is here, just below the dorsal nerve cord, also part of the lancelet. It takes in water here, passes through the gills, and then passes out the atriopore here. The digestive tract takes in food in this area, passes through as nutrients are extracted, and then what's left passes out the anus here. So this oral area is called the oral cirri. This filters all the water that passes and cleans out any large debris that may try to come in. It then enters into this atrial cavity down here. Water enters here after it's filtered, and after it passes through these gills to extract the oxygen. Then it passes out through the atriopore in this area here. Now, characteristic of all the notochords, all the chordata, is that instead of an exoskeleton, which is what we saw in the arthropod, they have an endoskeleton. And an endoskeleton is a skeleton that resides within the body and is covered by tissue and skin. Remember, the exoskeleton is on the very outside and has no covering. An endoskeleton obviously cannot be molted or removed or lost. I mean, it is whatever the organism has at the beginning, it has throughout its life. And so this is characteristic of especially the advanced chordatas, the vertebrata and the advanced cephalochordata. Bone is made up of a matrix which is composed of collagen, and calcium is laid down on top of this collagen and produces what is called the bone matrix. And the matrix is the most of the bone in terms of the percentage of its weight, and it is just an acellular hard material that makes up bone. Now, in the next few slides, we're going to be looking at other parts of bone. Now here we have the three bone cell types that exist in the bone matrix. The first of these is called osteoblast. And here is an osteoblast in large, and here's where they come from. They're generally on the outside surface of the bone associated with the periosteum, and they produce or form the matrix, the bone matrix. The second cell is called an osteocyte, and here's the osteocytes. The osteocytes tend to be within the bone matrix, in the area between the outside of the bone and the inside of the bone. And these are mature bone cells that maintain the bone tissue. Now, osteoblasts mature to form osteocytes. So at the same time that they are making matrix, some of them also mature to become osteocytes. The third of these cells is called an osteoclast, which is shown over here. Now, an osteoclast has multiple nuclei in a single cell, and you can see that they reside on the inside aspect of the bone. And what they do is resorb bone. So as bone grows, the matrix is laid down here. It gets thicker and thicker, but at the same time, it's resorbed here. So the circumference of the bone increases until it reaches a certain size, and then these two activities become in dynamic equilibrium. That is, the formation and the resorption go at approximately the same pace. Now, when we talk about bone, there's actually two types of bone that we have to talk about. The first of these is called compact bone. And compact bone is shown here and here. This is a piece of skull, as this diagram shows here. And it's also, compact bone is on the outside of this femur head here. And compact bone is dense and very hard, and it performs most of the function of support. The other type of bone is called spongy bone. Spongy bone tends to be on the inside, and there are more cells within this spongy bone. And then the spongy bone is also seen in here. And the purpose of the spongy bone is twofold. One is it acts as somewhat of a shock absorber if there's a contusion or another blow to the bone, and also more cells can live in this bone and help give nutrients to it. As I said before, collagen is the part of the bone is a protein that is laid down, and the calcium is associated with this, and that's what makes up the bone matrix. So the bone matrix is essentially made up of two things: collagen, which is the proteinaceous material, and calcium, which is what gives it its hardness. The periosteum is on the outside of the bone, and the periosteum is actually the only part of the bone that can actually feel pain. The periosteum has nerve endings and nerve fibers in it, so that it does feel discomfort or pain. It also contains the blood vessels and the various other tissues that are necessary to provide food and oxygen to the bone. And I'll show you a picture in just a minute how this material gets inside where the osteocytes are. But before I do that, we need to talk about two types of skeletons. Now, I'm showing you the various skeletal types in a human, but this is also true of other mammals and other more advanced vertebrata. First of all, the bone marrow resides within various bone tissues. Now, in the younger organisms, bone marrow tends to be present in much larger amounts, so that in the adult, it's present in the femur, in the iliac crest, in the hips, and also in the sternum. But as an organism, also in the backbone. As an organism matures, the sternum, there's a decrease in sternal bone marrow, a decrease in the backbone bone marrow, and an increase in the pelvic bone marrow. And about 65 to 70% of all the blood production occurs in the pelvis of an adult male or female. The axial skeleton is shown in orange here. The axial skeleton is that part of the skeleton that's the trunk, head, and neck. So you have the ribs, the sternum, the backbone, the pelvis, the sacrum specifically, and the head or cranium. And this is what's known as the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is the rest. That is the limbs that are attached, the hips and legs. This is what makes up the appendicular skeleton. Moving on, the second system I want to talk about briefly is the circulatory system. Now, what we will talk about initially is generally these systems, and then as we talk about specific classes of chordata, we'll talk about how they differ from each other in terms of some of these various systems. Now, this is the circulatory system, and circulatory system is made up of arteries. The definition of an artery is a blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart. It can be oxygenated, and it usually is oxygenated blood, but it can also be deoxygenated blood, and the only requirement is that it carries blood away from the heart. The vein is defined as any blood vessel that carries blood to the heart. Now, this can be a deoxygenated blood, and that's the most common type that's shown. That's why it's shown as blue here, and the artery blood is shown as red here. But the pulmonary vein, for example, carries oxygenated blood to the heart. And then between the two are the capillaries. And the capillaries is where all the excitement occurs. They are extremely thin-walled blood vessels, and at some point they have to become one cell layer thick, so that there's only one cell layer between the blood cells and the cells that are receiving oxygen from the blood cells. And this is the site of gas exchange. This is where oxygen is transported into the cells and carbon dioxide is removed from the cells and taken into the blood. And when we return into the next part, we will begin talking about more aspects of the circulatory system as well as other systems in the chordata.